Hi guys, this is Jake Alspaugh in the Center for Academic Achievement. This is another short video in our series for English 110 students. Today we're going to be talking about how to mine your text using the 10-on-1 technique described in Writing Analytically. And just a quick note, I'm going to use the word text to describe materials that you guys might be working with during your time in class. But text could be literally a text, so a piece of fiction that you've been assigned to read. It could be nonfiction, but text could also just be anything that you're assigned to work with. So in some of your classes, you might work with images that you need to mine and make observations about in academic arguments, or you might be asked to watch a music video or an advertisement or something like that. So when we say text, we don't just mean writing, we mean anything that we're working with, okay? So we're gonna talk about using the 10-on-1 method to dig into your text and make arguments. If you have not yet viewed our video on the method from Writing Analytically, I highly recommend watching that in conjunction with this video, because the method is basically the things that you should be doing to get to using 10-on-1 and making claims, okay? So watch the video on the method if you have not as well. So we're going to talk about evidence and claims today. Your professors are probably going to talk about this. They're going to ask you to find evidence in the text you're working with and make claims about it in your writing. For our purposes, evidence is the examples that we use to make academic arguments. So evidence are the observations, the things in the text that you're pointing out that you think are important, images, symbols, themes, things like that. So evidence are the things in the text that you're observing, and claims are the ideas, the arguments, and the so what moments that you're going to make based on that evidence that you observe in the material that you're working with. Okay, so we've got evidence in the text, and we're going to make claims about it, ideas, arguments in our writing. If you've read Writing Analytically, this section, they point out that there's really two ways to sort of think as you go about writing academically: deduction and induction. Deduction is reasoning from the general to the particular, okay? And induction is reasoning from particulars to the general. It's just the opposite. So another way to think about deduction, reasoning from the general to the particular, is you have an idea already and you use that idea to explain the text you're working with, okay? So you already have sort of a theory and observation, something that you know about the text, and then you're gonna go into it and you're gonna support, prop up that idea with things you find in the text, but you have the idea first, okay? Induction is just the opposite. Another way to think about induction is that you're going to make observations in the text and you're going to see what ideas emerge from them, okay? So it's really, where are you starting? With deduction, you have an idea already and you go and try to prove that idea sort of in the text. Deduction is you just look at the text with sort of a blank slate in your mind and just let the text speak for itself. And you see what ideas are going to emerge out of it. That is induction. So deduction is what Writing Analytically calls 1-on-10. And the idea here is that the 1 is the general idea or claim, and the 10 are the observations in the text you're going to use to try to support that claim. A lot of students start with deduction 1-on-10. We want to try to move to 10-on-1, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. But again, deduction here, a lot of students start here as they're beginning to write academically, and they start with a general claim or idea. Maybe they went online, right, or they got onto one of the websites that talks about the text you're reading. You got some Spark Notes or whatever, and then you go and try to prove that idea in the text, okay? 10-on-1 is just the opposite. Now the numbers have inverted, and the 10 are the observations that you found in the text, and you use that to make one really important idea or claim about the text. And when you go to write your actual paper, we sort of have this bouncing kind of diagram here. So you have a point and you make You use that to prop up sort of an idea or a representative example. And then you go to your second place in the text where you have this observation, and you point out how that's a recurring theme. So we have this bouncing back and forth between points and your idea. In doing that, we come out with a conclusion or a claim, a so what moment about the text. And this is what we want to be doing when we're writing analytically. So, okay, why do we not use deduction, or why do we want to try to move away from that? So these are the problems that come about from using 1 on 10 or deductive thinking. The main problem is that with 1 on 10 deduction, it just leads to superficial thinking, okay? Students a lot of times are going to do this because they're afraid to be wrong, okay? So they're afraid to let the text speak for itself and see what comes out, or they know that they need to have some kind of general point. So they get on, again, they get online and they learn something about the text, like this is what people generally might say. I don't know, you're reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So you get on Spark Notes and you see what the themes of The Raven are, what other people have thought about this, and then you go try to prove one of those ideas, okay? But you're starting with the idea. And this leads to a paper that we call sort of the demonstration paper, where you have an idea and you go through the text and you try to prove that the idea is generally correct, okay? So you're trying to demonstrate that you're right. Problem with that is it's a sort of a dishonest reading of the text. You've made an assumption already before reading it, and then you sort of cherry pick the parts of the text that are going to fit your assumptions. And by doing so, you've probably left out anything that doesn't quite fit with your idea or your generalization, right? So it's a superficial way of looking at the text. And generally, students do this and they end up pointing out a lot of different things in the text. They don't say anything super interesting or important about any of that. They've got a ton of observations, and it leads to a very shallow reading of the text. Sometimes I think about it as they've created sort of a wide pond. It's very shallow, but it's very wide. And professors are going to look for just the opposite out of you in English 110. They're going to want you to make deep wells, so very narrow, specific, pointed observations, and say a lot about why it's important. So why do we want to do 10 on 1 inductive thinking? First, it's more honest. So you've started with the details of the text, the things that you've observed, and you've seen what ideas have come out of that. You've let the text speak for itself, okay? It's more interesting and intellectually rigorous. It's a lot better to find a lot of meaning in the details of a piece and then to rather than to generalize about the text as a whole. So we want to really dive into the specifics. Third, it's going to improve your critical thinking. You're going to be a better writer and a better thinker if you use 10 on 1 to say a lot about very specific things. This requires that you get your hands dirty. You got to really dive into the text. You got to pull it apart, and you got to see what meaning comes out of it, okay? There is a potential problem with 10 on 1. It is that you have to be sure that you're saying something about the text as a whole as well. You have to make sure that the observations you're making are representative about the text as a whole. So it's possible with 10 on 1 to get too specific and make a point that doesn't really hold up in the larger themes of the text. So what you're going to need to do is whatever observations you're making, you need to point out, make that explicit for the reader, usually your professor who's reading your paper, that the observations you've made and the claims you've made are hold water in the text as a whole. They are part of a larger theme or pattern, okay? When you do 10 on 1, it's useful to notice a pattern, make the pattern explicit for your reader, so spell it out for them, and then dive into a couple of really specific incidents in the text for like an in-depth analysis in the bulk of your paper. So I'm going to give you an example from some real student writing who does a great job doing 10 on 1 inductive thinking. This is, he's writing about William Faulkner's Barn Burning. If you haven't read Barn Burning, I'm sure many of you haven't, but it is a classic in sort of the canon of Southern American literature. And just so you know what the student's talking about, the rough summary of the story is that it follows the main character Sartoris or Sardi and his family, mostly his father Snopes. They are poor farmers in the South in America before the Civil War, so in the antebellum South. And his father is an arson. So his father keeps burning barns down, which at the time was like a really serious crime, because people, keep their horses and their livestock, keep their feed in the farm. So you can really destroy a lot of property by burning someone's farm, like in the early 1800s, right? And so generally the idea of the story is that Sartoris is sort of pulled between loyalty to his family, his father who is a criminal, and sort of the morality and the law, and trying to be an upstanding citizen. He doesn't know what to do. He eventually leaves, sort of reports his father as an arson, and abandons his family. That's a general idea. So let's see what this student has to say about that. So I'm just going to read for a moment here. So Faulkner's 1938 barn burning is rife with two recurring symbolic images of fire and blood. Many read Faulkner's piece as attention to morality, Sartoris pulled between loyalty to family or the law. However, Faulkner wrote in the antebellum American South, a time of economic and sociocultural upheaval, especially between slave economies in the South and emerging industrial economies in the North. In this way, imagery of blood in barn burning can be seen as ties not just to family, a pretty straightforward reading of the text, but to land and time. Sartoris is not simply pulled between his law-breaking father and justice, but between the Old South, slave-driven and agricultural, and the coming New South, free and industrial. Sartoris' hesitance to move forwards and Faulkner's inherent skepticism of progress emerges any time blood is mentioned. In the courtroom, Sartoris feels the, quote, old fierce pull of blood, end quote. Later, after a fight with another boy, he refuses to allow his mother to wipe the blood from his face, instead seeing things through its red haze. In this way, Faulkner demonstrates the deep family connections of people to the South's land and ancestral heritage. Through imagery of fire, Faulkner evokes the lingering power of these deep-rooted connections. At times, their force seems to be dwindling, evoked when Snopes kindles a small fire for his family by the roadside, which does little to warm them. At others, Snopes lashes out violently, burning the barn which begins the short story, and attempting to do so again after the conflict with Major Despain. That fire is only useful to Snopes in violent and illegal acts suggests that the ways of the Old South will not be productive in the context of changing American sociocultural norms, and especially the country's dwindling tolerance for slavery. Sartoris' flight from his family leads the reader to believe that indeed things will change and move forwards, but his emergence from this imagery of fire and blood suggests that Faulkner was skeptical that the transition would or could be made smoothly or peacefully. Okay, so a lot going on here, right? But the general idea is that the student has dove into the text and they've seen, they've made this observation with these two symbols, blood and fire, which they are all throughout the text. Blood comes up constantly, fire comes up a lot. Obviously, it's a short story about burning of barns. And this student has ran with it, right? Like, this isn't sort of right or wrong, but it's really interesting what they've come up with here. So he's got a general idea that, hey, people tend to read the story as sort of like the tension of morality between family, the sort of criminal family and the law, between right and wrong. But the student says, no, like, we can go deeper than that. Like, Faulkner, through these symbols, is talking about people in the South before the Civil War still have slavery going on. And they're struggling with this. Times are changing in the North, where things are free. The Industrial Revolution is off and running, and the South is sort of behind. They're still in this sort of backwards, like slave-holding agricultural place, and people don't know what to do. And it's this upheaval of struggle, with people's being afraid to change, right? So he's saying something about this piece in a specific historical moment, and it's very cool. And we can imagine, this is just a general paragraph about what this student is going to dive into in his paper, but we can imagine him now diving very specifically into specific scenes where Sardi is in the courtroom and talking about the ties of blood with his family, and then specifically the scenes where there's fire, where there's a barn that's burning, and him analyzing those specific scenes. But he's going to keep doing that and keep pulling back to this idea of the changing times in the American South before the Civil War, right? So he's saying a lot about a very specific idea, specific observations, what he sees in this text, these images of fire and blood, right? So that's what we talk about when we're talking about 10 on 1, saying a lot about some very specific things, okay? Again, if you haven't watched our video on the method or read that section of writing analytically, do so, because it's going to give you the tools to get here, right? And I highly recommend, as you are writing in English 110, see if you can write a solid paragraph like this student has done, and take it to office hours, take it to your professor, and they'll give you feedback and like, yeah, this is awesome. There's an essay in here, right? Go and write it. Or they might say, you're a little off here. I don't think this holds water. But at least that way you'll know, and you can come up with a different idea and not, waste time writing on something that's not going to be productive. So see if you can write a really good, single paragraph about what your essay is going to be like this, okay? I hope that was helpful. Again, check out our video on the method, and I wish you luck as you are writing inductively in a 10-on-1.